Hello and welcome to the Faith is Strength podcast. I'm your host, Nochi Mendel, and I'm joined here today with my sister, Gneshe.
Woohoo! Hello, hello.
Thank you for joining
Thanks
yet
for having
again.
me.
The date of this recording is December 29th of 2019. It is the 8th day of Hanukkah. The topic of today's episode is individuality / you do not own your children. So it's a topic on parenting, focused and centered around the idea of individuality. Hanukkah is the festival of lights. Unfortunately, we had a tragic event happen right here in Muncie, a little bit too close to home, too close to comfort. There was a stabbing in Forshey at Rottenberg Shul, or in his house right next door to his shul. And I find these things to be reminders, aside from the practical, the hishtadlut, we have to learn how to protect ourselves, and we have to protect ourselves and all that stuff. It's a reminder that God chooses when we live, when we die, when we're born, when we leave this world. Even on the way here, I was driving down this road. It's dark, it's raining, and I'm like, a tree could fall on the car and kill me. I don't want to get into the conversation again. We've been there. We've talked about that. The anxiety mind, the things we think up, but it's yet still a reminder that life is fickle, short, unknown, and we could do all we can to try to protect ourselves, which we're supposed to. The Torah teaches that if somebody's coming to kill you, you need to kill them first. You have to preserve your life, but despite all of that, we still don't know when we come and when we go. It's a reminder to remember that we actually rely on Hashem to keep us safe and to talk to Him and to seek refuge in Him.
Well, tying it into the story that you just brought up, the attack that we just had, and we had a recent one in Jersey City as well. And I think that these things have happened so many times where, people send out prayers, people send warm, loving thoughts. And in reality, there's, we need to find ways to defend ourselves and protect ourselves.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's the practical part.
Well, the emotional part would be the spiritual part, the praying and connecting.
Yeah. There's the practical side, which is, like I mentioned, you have to protect yourself. I don't want to get into that too deeply because it just falls into politics.
No, but it really ties into what we're going to talk about today. Having a sense of self, having self-confidence.
Yeah, in that respect, it's
believing that you belong and that you deserve to have a good life.
Yeah, in the scheme of things, here in New York, anti-Semitism is growing. They say there's an 80 or 90% increase from 2018 with regards to specific anti-Semitic attacks in Brooklyn and Crown Heights. There's a lot that happened. A lot of it is on video as well. So, but like I said, I don't want to get into it, but we're living in a certain reality. We have to protect ourselves. All semantics aside, nobody is going to be there to protect you but you when push comes to shove. When these things happen, you have seconds, not minutes or hours to wait. Yeah, I don't think it's an issue to have these conversations if they're fruitful. It's very easy to slip into these types of conversations and they don't yield any results.
No, but it's important to mention it. It's important to bring it up because I think with awareness.
Right. So, that's why I mention the idea that you have to protect yourself, because these are just very, very basic human and logical things. If you want to stay alive today in our day and age, you can't rely on, for example, law enforcement. Law enforcement won't make it there on time. You have to ask yourself, what am I doing in order to be able to protect myself?
Right.
Anyway, that's that. Hashem should protect us, help us as we continue to face these issues around the world. As far as this topic goes, the topic of individuality and parenting, I don't know how else to say this, but to just jump right in. Many parents think they own their children.
I think it's a subconscious expectation. They're not aware that they have such a high expectation of their children, and generally it's them projecting what they expect of themselves onto their kids.
That might be a beautiful way to judge people favorably. I'm looking at not such a rosy picture. There are parents who literally think they own their children, like you own a piece of property or object. And because of this, I don't even know what to call it, false expectation,
Projection.
or because of this false assumption,
The toll it takes on the kid.
they potentially destroy their children.
Having your parents have that type of expectations of you growing up changes who you are as a person and ultimately as an adult.
The question is, first of all, do you understand what I mean when I say that? Because I'm at a loss for words right now, but this is a real phenomenon. I've known it for a long time. I've always despised it. I think it's wrong, and I think it plays significant factors in the detriment of a child's upbringing and education. I can't exactly put my words on it right now, but it's so real. And I'm not talking about any kind of rosy, nice, psychological version of it. I'm talking about the more nasty version of it.
The sinister.
Yes, the parents who know what they're doing. They know they're taking control, even though they may know it's wrong, yet they still do it because they're able to. So I do believe that there's different levels of owning a child. There are these levels that you're going to share because we've discussed about false expectation, and you could explain that. But then there's a more, like you said, sinister level, which is you know you have the upper hand and you abuse it, essentially.
Well, there could be many reasons for that, though. I mean, let's not even talk about narcissistic, abusive. Generally, people that are that way because of unresolved issues within themselves.
Or is it rooted in sucky education and upbringing on their own part? I look at parents who think they own their children as parents who don't know any better, and they actually think that they're supposed to treat their children like an object. You know, tyranny. They don't know better.
Well, I believe they either don't know better or they believe that is the only way. And it could be one or the other, or it could be both.
Which is essentially saying the same thing, because if they don't know any other way, then they don't know better.
And generally, it's generational trauma, carrying down what they knew. And there's no self-awareness. And they're carrying that on to their kids as well.
Owning their children. Boy, do I despise it. So I've seen it a lot in the ultra-Orthodox community, obviously, because that's where we come from. I don't know how prevalent it is in the secular world.
I believe the Asian community has a big problem when it comes to these things, where the parents have huge expectations of their children. And then I don't know if it's because the parents themselves were successful, or is it because they're always living up to other people, and it's a lack of self-confidence, and it's a lack of self-worth and self-identity. But then, at the end of the day, the outcome of this issue is that people don't have a sense of self. And what I see in our community a lot of is codependency because of it. Needing approval, needing validation for everything, every step of the way, every single thing we do.
And that's a direct result of the lack of individuality, which is at the crux of this topic. Of course, by solving the issue that we're discussing, you result in good individuality, healthy individuality. The issue is there because of the problem, of course. I'd love to solve it, but of course it doesn't just solve itself. We could have a conversation about it, but the reality remains such that the general population will continue to do what they're doing for the most part.
Well, we go back to what's comfortable. And so if that's how we grew up and we don't have awareness, then we go back to what's comfortable.
But these are also societal norms. So yes, there's some gradual change over millennia and
Correct.
Centuries and generations, but nothing's changing from one day to the next.
Well, what we could do is bring awareness by talking about it.
Yeah, ultimately that's the purpose of conversations such as these. And so I'd like to compartmentalize a little bit, even the little bit that we just discussed, because there's this detrimental consensus that parents have, or outlook that they carry, where they naturally feel like they own their child. And that in itself, all psychology aside, is just horrible and wrong. Now, that's leaving all psychology out. That's just wrong. The way that I conceptualize, and I've learned to conceptualize the whole idea that you have a child or you're a keeper of a soul, was taught by Shalom Arush in the Garden of Education, or Educating with Love. They bring forth this idea that children are souls that are entrusted in the parents' hands for safekeeping up until a certain age, essentially, when they're adults, and then they go out on their own. And then even beyond that, the role actually reverses, because while you safekeep them, and then you get old, and they essentially take care of you, and then you leave this physical world, and then, the cycle goes on. But when you learn about it in such spiritual terms, it paints a little bit of a different picture of what it means having a child. There's no ownership. Like, do you own you? Humans are not physical objects that we own necessarily. It shouldn't be viewed like that. Definitely not from a spiritual standpoint, because we don't choose, as I said in the beginning, when we come and when we go. So who does own us? Well, ownership or owning is a very limited word, but essentially we are a piece of God. We are a spark of divinity, and that spark is put into a body for a duration, and then it leaves. It goes back to the whole, the entity, the unity. But when we visualize these philosophical and spiritual concepts in a more practical sense, the ego could kind of slip away. Me and you are both parents. We understand what it means to have a child. We also understand what it may mean to think that we can control or tell the child ABC. And I'm not even trying to slip into educating here or telling a child to do something. It's just, I'm talking more about the notion of you and your consensus of your ownership of the child. Not even what the child does or doesn't do or what you tell him to do. It's how do we feel about our own children. And when we look at it from this more beautiful and spiritual perspective, which we believe to be more aligned with the truth, you basically glean a much fancier, a much healthier outcome, which is that you don't act in ways that show that you're a tyrant, essentially, because you don't own the child. The child was given to you for you to safekeep. And by safekeeping, we're talking about loving and protecting and nourishing and all the good stuff. Then it goes into these other facets of it, the psychology side of it, which can overlap a ton of different discussion, but maybe we could touch a little bit on the side of expectation.
Well, it made me think of something when you were talking about that. You know how some people have kids that they have an easier time with and some that they don't. And if you don't have kids, you can think about it in the sense of relationships, friendships, family members. People mirror us. People bring up our insecurities or our joys, the people we love to be around. And different people and different experiences and different personalities will mirror different parts of us, and they'll bring out something in someone else. And so noticing what parts of your kid bring up feelings of failure in yourself, shame. Our kids are a gift to us as much as it's the gift for us to raise them and help them become the best version of themselves they could be later on when they go on into life. They're also helping us learn and grow. And so somebody who's a tyrant to their children is allowing their ego to control a space where they can actually grow.
So that's some deep psychology. Let me see if I can wrap my head around that. There's so many points that you just made. I'm actually a little bit dumbfounded. So you're essentially saying that in relationships or with multiple children, the difference between the struggles within those is actually because of the mirror concept, meaning it's mirroring your insecurities, your issues, and therefore you struggle in one way with one individual and in another way with another individual. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
So that's really beautiful. That actually reminds me of a quote from Klosenberger Rebbe, where he says that the faults we see in others are the reflective ones of our own, right? We're very familiar with this quote.
Right.
To apply that to multiples where you have multiple children or potentially multiple relationships is actually really profound to think about in such terms.
I actually love the way this doctor that I follow on Instagram, Dr. Nicola Pera, explains ego, because when she would talk about it all the time, I had such a hard time understanding it at first. But the way she explains ego is the story that we've told ourselves from when we were children. So if we told ourselves the story of, I'm being rejected, my child is challenging me, I'm being challenged, I need to fight or flight, this person is making me have such a bad day, I need to protect myself. And these are all subconscious thoughts. But somebody who's being a tyrant essentially has the ego story of, I need to protect myself, I'm being rejected, I'm in fear, or whatever it is.
Even from their children.
Very much so. Because again, it comes back to mirroring. Something about the child's behavior, or something about that friendship, or something about your spouse, or something about your parent or your grandmother that's getting to you over and over and over again is bringing up that ego story. Now, ego is not all bad. Ego is there to protect us or to teach us what we need to see. Our mindset is what creates our reality. So I used to have a very hard time. I mean, I think on a logical level, I understood it so well, but on an emotional level, it just didn't click. And I always love, like Oprah used to always say, I think I even said in the last podcast episode, that aha moment, like when heart and mind lock together, and it just, you're in alignment and it syncs and it feels good and you just know that it's right. Ultimately, I do think most of our problems are one-sided, rooted in one place, rooted within ourselves. And we see the world in adulthood through our childhood experience. That's what's comfortable. That is our norm. There is no norm. You know how people talk about the norm? There is no norm. What every person grew up feeling is their norm. It's when we feel unrest within ourselves, or when we are triggered by our children or by relationships or friendships, that we feel unrest. That's what's messing up our norm. And then the next piece of it is, because we're learning to trust our inner voice and what's coming up.
Yeah, I don't refute that. If on the side of the individual, the tyrant, the issue may actually be one-dimensional, right? It could be ego, or ego in a combination with bad education, which kind of go together. But from the perspective of, say, a podcast host, where I'm just trying to observe the issue at large as it plagues the world and parenthood in general, I don't think it's one-dimensional in that sense. And I want to find those other pointers, because I think for some people it may be area A, for some people it may be area B. However, what you mentioned is so powerful and strong. It resonates with me. I could see that deep down, and at the crux of what you were saying, we have ego. And then, of course, the mirroring concept, but the tyrant has an ego issue. Something's being flared. If we could get to the root of that, which requires even deeper digging, then we may be able to uproot the issue at its roots.
One more point before we move on to the other section is, one thing that people forget, or maybe don't even realize, and this could be why people are so triggered by their children. Each and every single child that comes into this world is fulfilling their own path. They're fulfilling their own job here. And so we're constantly trying to clone them to be like us, to make us comfortable, to not bring up that uncomfortable ego story. And what's so important to remember is that each child individually is here to forge their own path, to work through their own struggles and tribulations, and to become the best version of themselves. And so in controlling them through our ego story, we're quelching their individuality. So that's definitely one perspective. And I know that not everyone understands it or sees it that way. And I also understand that.
I don't know. I could feel that. But first, we're doing a couple things. Amongst them, we're connecting my initial idea, my original idea, which is that there are parents who think they own their children. We bring that into the idea of children having their own self-identity or mission on earth. And by the way, that's a very Jewish concept. I think it was King Solomon who said, you have to raise a child, each to their own aptitudes, right? Everybody's here to complete a completely different set of tasks. different tafkut. So these are very Jewish and spiritual and kosher concepts. It's possible that my initial concern is rooted in these de facto character issues. But I almost feel like with all of those issues aside, there's still that baseline. Here's the question. If you remove or correct all of those issues, will parents not have that consensus? Or is there a completely separate body of education or lack of education that is giving parents that consensus, that they own their children and they could do whatever they want with their children and they could control their children, so on and so forth? Or is it truly just rooted in different character issues, ego, amongst other things? Now, as far as raising children according to their aptitudes, sure, absolutely. That I agree that could solve a lot of the symptoms or the repercussions of parents thinking that they own their children, right? Because what does a parent who thinks they own their child is that same parent who's going to do ABC, who's going to be the tyrant, who's going to tell you and show you and force you and punish you and all that stuff. So by learning that not all children are the same, we're not clones, we all have different feelings, different paths, and different journeys to follow, then it could help us appropriately deal with, I guess you could say, a symptom of this. It's still not touching the crux of the actual or core issue, and that is that parents think they own their children, and the question is why. It may be as simple as faulty education. Like I said, I shared the spiritual outlook earlier, and it's a beautiful outlook. Maybe if we were taught in a broad basis like that, more people would have that kind of outlook. There's this just feeling of ownership. And if you look at the way that people fight in court and use their children or over children, it manifests itself really strongly in those types of scenarios, amongst other scenarios. This feeling of like ownership, as if a child is just another piece of object.
It's mine. What's the big mine there? What's the big me? Ego. The ego of me is feeling threatened that I'm going to lose, that I'm not being heard, that I'm being rejected, that I'm being discarded, whatever your ego story is. And that ego story was created in childhood, and it was there to protect you. So let's say your friends were fighting with you as a kid. Your Rebbe was fighting with you. Your Rebbe slapped you up. What did the ego do to protect me? It told me a story. Ego doesn't have to be a bad thing. When your ego is playing itself up again in adulthood, that's your time when you could say, hold on. What is my ego trying to tell me? What did it protect me from before? What's the story that it told me to protect myself? And how is it hurting me now? And that's our inner voice telling us, either I need to fix something or it's taka protecting you from something. But in this case, we're talking about it hurting you, hurting a kid, hurting somebody.
You know, the whole point of the conversation here is to unravel this underlying idea.
Okay, let's go back to it. I'm not a therapist, so I can't tell you technical terms, what we call clinical terms. I can't tell you those, and I don't have backing for them. But because I'm a person who felt like I had no identity and had no inner voice, which we all do have, it's just that we get so used to blocking it out by listening to other people, shutting it down by living for other people, that I come back to this point very strongly. Whether it's court, whether it's education, whether it's hitting your kids or abusing kids, I believe it all comes down to ego. And what's ego in this case? We'll go back to the explanation that Dr. Nicola Pera explains, because I found it very, very helpful to understand. Ego is me. So why does a parent own their child? Because my kid is hurting me. Maybe an easy way to understand it or to explain it would be, let's say there were no children and there was a couple getting divorced. And they're not fighting over a child, but they're fighting over possessions. It's my house, it's my money, it's my jewelry. And there's this power struggle over who's going to get it. And what's the struggle? What's the fight? It's ego protecting me. And the me is the story that we told ourselves. It's a subconscious story we told ourselves when we were children, experiencing something on a similar level of magnitude. So if I was a child who felt like something was being taken away from me or I was losing it, my fight or flight instincts jumped in to protect me. And my ego story became fear. I'm losing out. I'm being rejected. I don't matter. And now as an adult, I'm experiencing the same feeling, totally unrelated, but your brain remembers, your nervous system remembers, and it kicks in, and it's feeding you the same story to protect the me. So going back to court where parents are fighting over a child, or parents that abuse children, or parents that are telling their kid what type of career they need to have, ultimately it's about the parent's ego, the parent's me story that's kicking in. It's their fight or flight kicking in and causing them to treat their children this way. I feel like that almost like excuses the parent treating their child that way, but that's not the case. But I think it's easier to understand it that way. It's fear. It's fueled by fear.
It's possible that it's all ego behind this. But this is why we're having this conversation, because I want to unravel it. I'm not quite seeing it yet. It's possible that by continuing to unfold the various nuances of it, we might come to agree that it's rooted in ego. I do agree that ego is a huge thing. In the case of the court example, I'd like to propose that unlike objects, which is the example that you used, I'd like to propose that humans, children, are the exception. That is the difference. It's not like an object, and the reasoning behind the behavior is not necessarily the same reason that you would find with respect to objects. When a couple are in court and they're fighting about their house or their belongings, these are objects that in the conceptual, normal world, we do believe we own. Even though, as Rabbi Nachman says, we don't take anything beyond the grave, right? You get amass wealth. You're not going to, when you die,
can't take it with you when you
can't
go.
take it with. Despite that, from a very practical and normal, realistic standpoint, the way that everybody views these things, yes, we own objects while we're here. Humans, we don't own while we're here, because essentially you have responsibility over a child for until they're adult, depending on where you live. But beyond that, you don't own them, and you didn't even own them before then. So I think it's specifically with human children that we need to adapt a new outlook, a new understanding of what it means that we are taking care of the child. And I've thought about this for many years. I haven't yet bumped into anything that indicates that there's a specific thing that's causing this general consensus. I just feel like it's maybe lack of education or poor education. The way we portray things, and maybe the way that we see, maybe it's handed down, right? The way that we see our parents treated children and their parents, so on and so forth.
Our norm becomes our perspective.
Yeah, so it may just simply be the way that everyone's growing up and just continues to carry forward, and it never changes. Maybe it could be changed with something as simple as actually having some sort of parenting course thrown into the curriculum system, into the school system, added to the curriculum, where you're teaching basic human stuff, even though that's a little bit far-fetched, my spiritual imagination. But it's possible that something as simple as that can solve it. Because going back to ego solves a lot of things. And of course, if people would rid themselves of their ego through education and hard work, there's a possibility that they wouldn't get into such fights, say they were in court. However, I just don't see it that takes away from that misconception that the child is mine. The concept of mine can't be applied to child. And by the way, I just want to say on the bright side of this, that when you get past that incorrect, that wrong perception, you enter essentially a higher level of living, loving, and beauty, because you're treating the child as an individual that you were blessed with the opportunity and responsibility to take care of them. But you understand that you don't own them, which is why you appreciate them and you treat them as a human even when they're young, so on and so forth. I could go into all the beauty of it, but you understand what I'm saying. There's a huge part that changes the second you acknowledge that it's not black and white. It's not I own you, I don't own you, so on and so forth.
Well, it shifts it into that. Well, it shifts it into that space of acceptance. versus tug of war fighting. Like the black and white would be, I'm fighting reality. I'm fighting my child. I'm fighting my relationships for what they are, to suit me, to make me comfortable, versus the level of acceptance where you could see the beauty of it and you can flow with it.
Yeah, I do believe that just by adapting this mindset, for example, if you adapt this mindset, you can have a better time, a more humane time in court, even if you have an ego, because you may put principle ahead of ego. So say I have an ego, but I know that I don't own my child, I may put the principles of me knowing that I don't own my child, godly, spiritual principles before my ego, and make the right choices and not use my child as a pawn despite my ego.
Because I'm doing the right thing.
Presumably, if my theory is correct, it could even supersede and outweigh psychological and characteristic type of behavior improvements and stuff like that.
I do want to mention that ego is a very important piece. I think we said it before. I don't know. Having an ego is a very important piece of our journey. It's not something we need to fight. It's just something we need to be aware of.
Yeah.
What is the ego story telling us? It's either teaching us something or it's helping us in some way.
I'm with that. I mean, I know myself enough to know that I have, and I've always had a big ego. And I think all of character refinement and introspection, not all of it, but a huge portion of it revolves around the study of the ego that is you and the refinement of it. So it's a huge and central part of this whole Jewish concept of fighting your Yetzer Hara, right, or evil inclination. That the ego is at the center of the stage of it all. So absolutely. But at the same time, just like all things in evolution, it plays a vital role in a lot of survival type stuff. So it's not like we could just no ego, although, from the Jewish perspective, you have these individuals, yechidim, these specific types who they work day and night to rid themselves of the ego, right? They want to be completely bittul, nullified before Hashem and the ultimate presence. But for a practical person, I mean, just picture for a moment, world leaders set aside their ego and they allow their fluffy side to run the show. It's cute concepts, but we're not practically in a world that could maintain such a level, such a frequency.
Well, let's do what I do in peer work. What do you mean when you say you have a big ego? What is that story that's you?
The easiest way for me to identify it is with people who try to, I suppose, step on it. So, right, because that's like one of the easiest identifiers. If I'm on the road, somebody pisses me off, I'll show you, right? So you can't deny that. That's a natural. Now, granted, I've been working on myself for many years, so more likely than not, I won't do anything about it because I've learned to control myself.
So what's it actually bringing up when somebody's in your space?
So what it seems to be bringing up is just, I don't know. I don't think very deeply into it beyond knowing that, this is my ego. So, okay, so if we want to delve deep, which is important, the truth is I don't know. All I know is that if I'm on the road, okay, granted I have a lot of control these days because I worked on myself, but say I'm having a bad day and someone's really, I don't know what they're doing. They're not letting me pass, and these taxis who drive 14 miles an hour, oh gosh.
So relatable.
But you're in a rush, let's say,
right.
A serious rush. You need to get somewhere. You're rushing to the doctor, your kid is sick or he cut himself. Who knows? Whatever the scenario is. So something that could really trigger you. And trigger me it will. Right?
That's funny. So it's funny how you said the taxi, because that's actually really relatable. I'll be behind somebody who's slow, and I'm constantly, between appointments or taking the kids to appointments or whatever it is, in a rush, always on a timeline. And I'll start cursing and shouting and getting so annoyed. So let's think about this. Let me think about what it brings up for me.
It's funny because, after you blow up, if you're very self-aware, you kind of laugh it off. You're like, okay, that was silly. But another interesting thing I mentioned before, how principle could supersede these things. When I remind myself of my principles of Emunah and very high level spirituality things that are in my core that I believe, those are the things that will supersede ego and me losing myself and all. It's a tool when it comes to these things, but it is a tool nonetheless, a strong one. I could more often than not, I'll pass, you could say, pass these tests, if you will, using just principle. Is my ego ego being tickled? Yes. My principle is so much stronger that I won't even do anything about it. I'll just kind of like give it a little laugh.
What would you describe as principle? Value.
My principles and faith and stuff like that, which teach me that everything that happens is from Hashem, and everything that happens is for my good, so on and so forth. So if a taxi's pissing me off, like, seriously, so now if you study these things enough, you learn to get your character under control. But these are using high-level principles that are not actually touching the crux of the matter. Like I said, my ego is still tickled, but the principle is so valuable and high-standing for me that it supersedes what my ego is. But it doesn't always work. It only works when you maintain it and you're really living the life, the spiritual life. But it's an interesting observation because I had mentioned it earlier. But anyway, back to the ego. What do you mean? What does it bring up?
So the question is, what does it bring up? So what's the story I'm telling myself about this taxi going slow? What are the thoughts that come up? Oh, you idiot! You're driving so slow. You don't know how to drive. Dig deeper. You're making me late.
You're trying to. Well, you're basing it off the premise that there's a story behind it, right? That's what you explained earlier, and it's a story of perhaps childhood or younger years.
Well, it's the story that protected you back then.
I've never really confronted ego with these models of rebuilding, so I would have to think about that. But I can think about that because I understand what you're getting at. If I'm behind the taxi and he's going slow,
what are the actual thoughts besides the anger, the frustration, the annoyance? What's the actual thoughts? Like, I had one day where I was turning into into a street, and a guy was making a left turn out of that street, so essentially he'd be going into me, and I actually had the right of way, and I rolled my window down and was screaming at this guy. I had the right of way, blah 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 blah. And I drive away, and you calm down, the rush of adrenaline relaxes, and I'm thinking to myself, what was that? What was behind that screaming? What was behind that? You're getting into my space. In that particular instance, it was fear. It was fear. I was scared he's going to crash into me. I was, it happens in a split second, but that's what subconscious is. It's all these filed experiences that live inside your body. And so when you're experiencing a similar feeling, because it's not the same situation, but it's a similar feeling that you did as a kid or as you were growing up, that reaction is stored in there, and it kicks in when you get that type of feeling, or when you're going to get a different type of feeling, a different reaction is going to come up.
So I'm trying to think what could be behind, what are the stories that are behind some of the reactions, the natural reactions that I have when my ego is triggered. And I don't know.
I could tell you this.
If I'm behind a slow taxi, for example, the thing that's really getting to me as far as I could, as deep as I could think at this moment, of course, next time something like this happens, I'm actually going to try to dig deep, is that, when he's going slow, it's actually pissing me off that he's wasting my time. And I value time. I'm a business person of close to 10 years. To me, time is everything. Schedule is everything. So it's actually pissing me the fuck off that this guy is going 14 miles an hour and I have shit to do. To me, it's just standard ego. I have things to do, blah, 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 right? So,
So he's doing this to me. When we talk about the concept of time, there is no time, right? Let's go into that. There is no time.
What do you mean? Where does that come in?
Because if you break it down even further and you think about it.
Oh, you're talking about time in terms of me feeling
being
like
late.
I don't, yeah.
So the bottom line is that there's more. The point is that there are so many levels of awareness. There's so many levels to awareness. So you might understand that you have what you called a big ego, or maybe an ego that gets triggered easily. I personally found journaling extremely helpful in breaking down these scenarios. It's a practice that actually takes time. We're not going to change the behaviors that we're doing in one day. And especially, and by the way, all of this ties into, being raised the way we're raised, whether it's being shut down by your parent or living the life that your parent expects of you, and whether it's a conscious or subconscious path that you're living, it comes down to, to break those stuff open, to have awareness and to change them. This is why it's so intricate. And this is why it's actually so important for parents not to shut down their children's inner voice and even their own.
Yeah, so I'm highly into philosophy and deep philosophical thought. One of the greatest lines I've ever heard, and I've internalized it pretty well, is that, you know how people always say, I don't have time, I'm running out of time, so on and so forth, right? Even such as I lightly indicated, by giving the example of the taxi who's driving slow. One wise man once said that all we have is time. And from a philosophical perspective, essentially that's all we really have, right? All we really have in this world is time. Meaning we have nothing else but time.
Right.
So obviously it's a matter of perspective. And again, I use those principles to very often override my ego, the stuff that is triggered naturally before the sophistication comes in. So I'm triggered, I pull up the sophistication, my education, all that stuff, and it works brilliantly. But I agree, all of this ties directly into the subject matter here, which goes back to children. We're essentially children ourselves talking about these things, because what I wonder is, with proper education, would we potentially have these things under control going into adulthood, and would we not have to solve them while we are adults? Because, we are talking about education and essentially reformatting the way that kids are brought up so that when they are parents, they treat their children like the souls that they are, the individuals that they are. Well, so it all comes back down to education.
Well, that brings up a thought of something you were saying earlier, which is the people that work on themselves to not have any ego, to present themselves before God as completely pure. And I don't know that that's possible, because we do need contrast in order to grow. So that's why this goes back to what I said earlier, where we need ego. But we could do what you're doing, which is, I notice I have ego and I'm pulling out my skills not to act on them. But we can also use that opportunity to understand what that ego story is to essentially improve it.
Certainly, that's the therapeutic and the healing and growth strategy and avenue, for sure. That's what they're hyper focused on, is finding those things, using them and building on them.
So coming back to what you were saying about educating, I do believe that we could educate through educating ourselves and educating our children about acceptance of who we are, acceptance of ourselves, acceptance of the paths we choose. That's our internal guide. However, I don't think they're never going to have contrast. They're going to have different tribulations. They're going to have different contrasts that's going to come up.
Absolutely.
And that's part of growth.
It's an important and very needed part of life in general. I mentioned earlier those tzaddikim, those yechidim, who they are able to nullify themselves or really, really work out the ego. But those are individuals. And that's one area. Even with the biggest people that we look up to, they may have been perfected in one area, but really weak in others. That's just a reality, right? Human rabbis of our past, our sages, were not angels. They may have focused really strongly in 5 areas, but don't get it twisted. They were humans nonetheless, and they struggled in one area or another. In general, struggle philosophically and from a spiritual perspective is needed. Just like your evil inclination, that side of you that wants to go to the right and to the left, just all of these facets are needed. So is the ego. So are all of these parts of us. So I guess I'll finish off with this, and then you could let us know what you think, because I don't think by any means that this topic is solved.
I would love to hear if somebody had a different take on it.
Yeah, because it's just been sitting on me for years. So I guess we'll end it with this, and you could chime in when I'm done. I don't think we are by any means done with this topic. Of course, we'd love to hear if anybody has any insight on it. I think we're touching on certain parts of it, certain areas of it. I don't even know if we had the right words to describe what it is that I'm thinking, but all I could do is kind of plead to parents to relearn, re-educate what it means to be blessed with the opportunity to be entrusted by Hashem, by God, with a soul, with a human life, and let go of the notions, any notions of ownership and control and tyranny, and rather embrace a more spiritual, loving, and holistic approach to child rearing and upbringing. This will in turn benefit you and your child or children. Love and acceptance pays off. Doesn't matter how far gone you think your child is, or how off the path you think they are, so on and so forth. Love and acceptance pays off. It pays dividends at the end of the day.
Yeah, I really like what you said. Love and acceptance is, well, openness really is by allowing your child or children to be who they are. You're paving the way for the universe. You're giving back to the universe, really, because we're constantly evolving. And by allowing people to be who they are, they're bringing the universe to where it needs to be. Ultimately, I wanted to finish off by leaving these thoughts about if you grew up with shutting down your voice, or you have no idea how to listen to your inner voice. First of all, there's hope. Every single person has an inner voice. And like we said earlier, the ego is not a bad thing or a negative. It doesn't have to be a negative thing. If it's bringing up negative, it's bringing up something. But feelings that you feel are your intuition, are your inner voice. They're your guiding angels. If it doesn't feel right, you know based on how you're feeling. So if you have a hard time thinking about what to do, tune in to how you're feeling. And it's practice like anything else. And so if you grew up constantly shutting it down or constantly living for others, it's going to be hard to tune into it. Don't quit just because it's hard at the beginning. Give it that chance. Tune into what you're feeling. Learn to trust it. Learn to go with it.
Brilliant. So basically, in other words, if your parents suck and they refuse to change, you as an adult, you could take the initiative and change even as an adult or an older person. You weren't given the chance. Your parents weren't the reality of this rosy notion that I'm proposing they should be. You can change. You could take the step forward, re-educate, relearn, and be the change for your children, which in turn will be the next generation of parents. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, God bless you. Hold up. Wait a minute. Let me put some thoughts in it. It is now mid-March, during the coronavirus pandemic, and I just finished editing this episode. It's weeks after me and Gneshe recorded. I knew that when we recorded, we weren't quite hitting the spot. After sitting with Gneshe trying to dissect this phenomenon, and ending the episode, I guess you could say, unresolved, we continued to converse about it for some hours over WhatsApp. I didn't feel like it hit the nail on the head. I think we were touching on some important pieces, but just kept missing the crux of the matter. Oftentimes, as has happened now, clarity comes after the conversation. So now, weeks later, after discussing it with Gneshe post-recording, after re-listening and giving myself some time to reflect on the matter, I'd like to take a minute to clarify what it is that we were trying to get at, because it was a mere 1 hour after we recorded when we agreed that we figured out what it is that we're trying to get at. The key words that we were looking for were as follows: respecting the human status. This is what we were trying to get at, but we were falling just shy of. This broader issue is described by the holistic psychologist on Instagram as follows. She writes these words, I quote, "As adults, we are unconsciously addicted to controlling the emotional states of those around us. Managing the emotions of others becomes a preoccupation. For some, it becomes borderline obsession." End quote. Reading this, I'm like, yes, that's it. This is it. This is what I was talking about. With an even worse connotation, though, physical control. Maybe you could understand better if you look at the relationships. Not child rearing, look at relationships. Maybe you could understand this phenomenon through the eyes of relationship. How many people do you know that tell their spouse what they can and cannot do, where they can and cannot go, what they should or should not wear? You don't have to answer, because the truth is it's many. And by many, I'm referring to most people you know. The fact is, it's a pandemic, like the coronavirus. Probably even kills more people physically and emotionally than any physical disease currently in circulation, because married couples think they can control one another. In most serious relationships, spouses often feel like they lose their sense of freedom and individuality somewhere along the way, somewhere along the journey. It doesn't start out that way. No, everything's beautiful in the outset. Somewhere along the way, there's forms of control. All of a sudden, you need to talk in a way that doesn't trigger your spouse. Now you need to not wear an article of clothing that doesn't upset your partner. Now you need to not hang out with certain friends because your partner is jealous, right? This is not one or two people's issue. This is close to most people you know. The degree varies, but the phenomenon holds true. Adults are addicted to controlling the state of those around us. This is what I was referring to. You want to transition from a state of control or feeling of ownership to a state of freedom and individuality. You do not own your children. Teachers don't own their students. Couples don't own their spouse. And I say own, the word own, because it almost sounds inappropriate, or like I'm using the wrong word for this. The reason I use the word own is because it's the strongest term that illustrates how humans act with objects. This is how we treat things, right? We do what we want with a piece of property that we own, with a toy that we bought in the store. Stop doing what you want to your child, your spouse, your student, your peer. Start respecting the human status. The status that by virtue equals individuality and freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of expression. What I am proposing to you today is that there is a high-level status that humans carry. This is the human status. This is because you have a divine intellect / soul. And now, because of this unfathomable worth of this entity, of the soul, each of us have rights, and we should be free to live out and express ourselves in our journey in our individual ways, without anyone, not even a parent, hindering it. This is a next level understanding of the underlying purpose of child rearing. Parents are entrusted with souls to care for them, to build a foundation for the child to pave their own path on, not to take it away and rob them of their gift. Know this, that by controlling, abusing, and thinking you own your child, you are literally robbing them of their heavenly gift of life. You're taking away their freedom and their expression. You're a thief. You are literally no better than someone who takes a person against their will as a slave. Don't think that the title parent absolves you of your indiscretions. You will be held accountable for your actions just the same. Children are gems. Children are gifts. Treat them as such and allow them to start forging their own way forward. Allow them to start living. Thank you.